Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining Jewish National Fund for the first event of our BiShvat programming. My name is Julia Pratt, and I'm proud to serve as the JNF Campus Fellow at Tulane University. I'm a current senior, and I'm pursuing a double major in Jewish Studies and Political Science. After graduation, I will pursue a master's in Jewish Nonprofit Management at Hebrew Union College. Additionally, I'm excited to share that I have just joined the JNF Future Board in South Florida, where I will be helping build a JNF Future chapter in Palm Beach County. Additionally, to being a JNF Fellow at Tulane, I have also been involved with Stand With Us, Camera on Campus, Hillel, Chabad, and Kappa Kappa Gamma. This year, college students from across the country came together to plan and execute a week of interactive programming to celebrate Tu B'Shvat. Over the week, we have evening programs each night to celebrate Tu B'Shvat and the range of JNF's work in Israel. These programs are free of charge and will be available to attend via Zoom or on Facebook Live. We also want to thank our partners at Yavna on campus for helping us plan and execute this week of programming. Of course, the best way to celebrate Tu B'Shvat is to plant trees in Israel, and I encourage everyone to join me at myjnf.org/TBS on campus and plant trees in Israel in honor of loved ones, friends, and family. Tonight, I am thrilled to welcome you all to our program on Israel's water solutions featuring Seth Siegel. When we traditionally think about Tu B'Shvat, we might not always think of water, since after all, Tu B'Shvat is the holiday of trees. However, trees and water are definitely connected. Jewish National Fund has been working to bolster Israel's water economy by developing alternative water sources, advancing Israeli agriculture, and improving water quality. JNF's work with water has increased Israel's water economy by over 15% throughout the treatment, recycling, and collection of both waste and runoff water, responsible aquifer drilling, and river rehabilitation. There's no better person to educate us on the incredible work Israel has done to become a leader in alternative water sources and solutions than Seth Siegel. Seth M. Siegel is a serial entrepreneur, water activist, and New York Times bestselling author. His critically acclaimed award-winning book, Let There Be Water, Israel's Solution for a Water-Starved World, has been published in 19 languages and is on sale in more than 50 countries. His newest work, Troubled Water, What's Wrong with What We Drink, sets forth an ambitious agenda for a fundamental rethinking of America's drinking water system. Seth has another book coming out this May called Other People's Words, Wisdom for an Inspired and Productive Life that reflects a lifetime of collecting inspirational quotations. In addition to his books, Seth is a senior fellow at the University of Wisconsin Center for Water Policy. His commentary on a range of topics has appeared in many leading publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Seth has spoken on water issues at more than 325 venues in 68 cities, 26 states, and on 4 continents, and during the coronavirus lockdown to dozens of others via video. For his work in communicating water needs, he was named one of the 100 Global Water Heroes. For more information, visit www.sethmsiegel.com. You can connect with Seth on Twitter at Seth M. Siegel. After Seth gives his presentation, we will have time for questions, so please be sure to send any questions you might have through via the Zoom chat. It's an honor to have Seth here, and thank you so much, Seth, for joining us to launch our week of programming.
Well, it's great to be with you all. Thank you for inviting me. And I hope to speak for a few minutes, then maybe we can open it up and have a conversation about what's on your minds. The topic today is, of course, is Tu B'Shvat, inspired by is trees. It's one of God's great gifts to us, and God has helped in his work, or her work, or their work, as the case may be with modern linguistics, by a great organization of JNF, which I'll talk about more in a few minutes. But for those of you who don't know it, JNF in its origins did a most remarkable job to reforest what was a barren land. In antiquity, actually, the land of Israel was a very treed place. Many fruit trees grew throughout the land, and the land of Israel supported a population then, in about 2,000 years ago, about 4 million people. There was plenty of water used for that and to grow the trees and to provide the water for the people to live their lives. And then after the destruction of the Second Temple, it turned out that the Romans chopped down all those trees and used it for fuel to power their industry and keep themselves warm in winter. So it became a barren land. It became a largely deserted land. And then about 125 years ago or so, the Jewish National Fund gets created. And it has amongst its many different goals the idea of restoring the land to its former glory. And in the interim, I've lost track of the number. Maybe somebody from the JNF staff here will know the number, but it is a gigantic number of trees that have since been planted by JNF to the benefit of the environment and the future of Israel. Let me talk tonight, if I can, about innovation, first generally, and then more specifically about water. And let me start by saying this. Although it turns out that the coronavirus vaccine was invented by two American companies, Moderna and Pfizer, I don't think anybody anywhere in the world would have been terribly shocked had it been that the vaccine had come out of Israel. And the reason for that is that the world has, in a sort of a complacent way, come to understand that for every major global problem that exists, Israel, in some form or another, is working on a solution. Whether it's cybersecurity, or computers, or laptops, or cell phones, or how to use them, or financial technology, or medical devices, in area after area, climate change, it doesn't really matter what the topic is. Find a global concern, and Israel is working one way or another, not as the government, but as private individuals coming together, banding together in companies and organizations, sometimes with the support of JNF, but often not, coming up with a solution. And it's not surprising when you look at little Israel, which is just slightly over 9 million people altogether, the tiniest fraction of the world's population, that last year, cybersecurity is now probably the gravest threat to global security. Cybersecurity, private equity spending, 20% of the worldwide spend was spent by companies spending it on Israeli innovation in Israel. And you learn from that idea the fact that Israel is an answer for just about every problem that exists. Now, one of the problems facing the world today, you may not know this because you go into the bathroom, you turn on the shower, turn on the sink in your kitchen, you don't think very much about it. But around the world today, we are facing a grievous problem of increasing water scarcity. Specifically, why? Well, there is obviously a vast amount of water, but most of it is either dirty or salty or unusable for one reason or another. So the available supply of water is small and actually shrinking because of climate change. And so in addition, you also have a growing global population. We're about 7.5 billion people now, and maybe the UN has it that will be growing up to about 10.5 billion people by mid-century before it levels off. We also have a situation that's actually good news, but bad for water. And that is that the world population is growing ever more affluent. And as people grow more affluent, they migrate from a diet of corn or wheat or potatoes or rice to a diet more like the Western diet, which is very animal protein driven. And whether you yourself are a vegetarian or a vegan, you probably aren't a vegetarian or vegan because you can't afford animal protein, but because you choose to do so for health reasons or ethical reasons or religious reasons, but for no other reason. And so the world is facing a situation now that the guess is that in the next 8 years, 1.3 billion currently desperately poor people will rise out of poverty into the middle class. And with that also more showers, more electricity, which consumes a great amount of water, and mostly more food. So why is Israel a center of innovation? How did this come to be? Well, I wrote my book, Let There Be Water, about this. And Julia, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for mentioning the fact it's now out around the world. The book is out in 19 languages. Actually, I just got approached by an Arabic language publisher in the United Arab Emirates about doing the book in Arabic now, which would be very exciting. But it's now out in many languages around the world, and people are learning from this. And what is it that they want to learn? Well, it turns out that Israel, about 100 years ago, began to understand that the Zionist dream, it wasn't yet Israel. Israel doesn't get formed until 1948. It's the 1920s. The Zionist leaders in the land of Israel say, we won't be able to succeed if we don't have a solution to the world's water problems, and particularly our water problems. We won't be able to welcome new immigrants. We're going to be too short. We won't be able to grow our own food. We won't be able to have thriving industry. We need, therefore, to do something to fix this problem. And so they put some of their best minds, and particularly one guy in particular, I regard him as the Leonardo da Vinci of water. I write about him at some length in the book, Let There Be Water. And this man, his name is Simcha Blas. Simcha Blas comes up with almost every water innovation in the course of about 10 or 20 years. Comes with nearly every water innovation that today the world utilizes in addressing its biggest water problems. He comes up with how to take wastewater and reuse it for after treatment to be used for agriculture. He comes up with the idea of how to make desalination work effectively. He comes up with the idea of drip irrigation. And in all the many years since, Israeli scientists and engineers and business people have found ways of making all this so much better, so much more effective, so much more cost effective. And therefore today, Israel is a model for the world at large about how to manage water, how to think about water, how to educate young people about conservation. It's been a real change. Now, I only want to speak for another few minutes because I'd like to open it up to questions, but I'd like to say that if you've been following Israel in the news over the last 6 months or so, 7 months, you've certainly noticed that Israel has been signing peace treaties and normalization agreements with a whole bunch of Arab states, Morocco, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and Sudan. And what's interesting is that in every single one of those agreements, every single one, access to Israeli water technology and Israeli water know-how has been a feature of why this is going forward. And before those handful of months where we have had this, in the handful of years before that, a large number of other countries in Africa, some in Asia, that have not had diplomatic relations with Israel, but have water scarcity problems, have been finding their way to making peace with Israel and signing peace agreements. And I've tracked this, 8 for 8 of the last 8 before these 4 Arab states, and announcing why they were coming to terms with Israel and making diplomatic relations with Israel. 8 for 8. So the reason was because they wanted access to Israeli water technology. Not only that, but significantly that. And so therefore, Israel, Prophet Isaiah said that Israel would be a light unto the nations. And I'd like to think that that's true all the time anyway. I mean, it's what I believe myself. It's why I'm a Zionist and why I'm a friend of Israel. But Israel demonstrates that again and again and again, day in and day out in this way. Now, most of this is carried on the backs of Israelis themselves. I've been to Israel many, many times. I lived there as a graduate student. I know the country extremely well. Most of this innovation is done by Israelis, but it's not done exclusively by Israelis. It's also been done in a meaningful way by support from the Jewish National Fund, JNF. Much of the success that Israel has had is its own homegrown success, but it didn't get to this great state where it is right now by itself. JNF played a role too. So when we talk about water, sometimes you'll hear people say that the wars of the 21st century will be fought over water. And frankly, that's certainly possible. There's growing problems with the Indus River, which feeds Pakistan and parts of lower countries that flows from China and then into Pakistan. Big problems. There's a big problem in Africa with Ethiopia damming the Nile River, which is going to create problems with Egypt and Sudan and other countries. There's problems in other countries around the world as well. Elsewhere in Asia, Turkey is damming the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and that's going to create problems for Iraq, for Iran, for others, Syria. So it's possible that there'll be wars over water, but I don't think so. I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is because Israel has shown the way that water can be used as a tool for coexistence, for cooperation, and even sometimes for peace. And that's a very exciting message for the world. So Israel's been a model for Israel on how to live people to live their lives for years now. But it's also going to be a model for nations on how to address their water scarcity, their water problems, and understand from the model of what Israel has done that they too can do the same. So let me stop there with that optimistic note and open it up to questions if anyone has any, and if not, to say lehitraot and Chag Sameach on Tu BiShvat.
Thank you so much. Let's just jump right into it with our first question. How can college students make a difference on campus with water solutions?
So there's a bunch of, that's a great question, Julia. There's a bunch of ways that college students can make a big difference. And college students have a way of sort of thinking that, sort of like not woe is me, but little me, what difference can I make? And the truth of the matter is, the great thing about water problems are that they come at you very slowly. They give you lots of lead time to develop solutions. And here, in this case, most of the solutions already are pre-baked. We know what they are going to be. So as a result, what college students can do, depending upon what the interest you have, is whether academic approach, professional approach, or just as an interested citizen, you can play an important part. If you're interested if you're engineering minded, I would argue now is about as good a time as there's ever been to pursue a career in water related engineering, environmental engineering, whether it's wastewater or drinking water or water for irrigation. These are all going to be booming categories, and I'd urge you to do that. If you're a more liberal arts minded student, I would urge you to study public policy, because water is going to be playing a significant part. And if you're just a civic minded person, well, you can learn a lot about water. I obviously can recommend my own books, Let There Be Water and Troubled Water, but it's a topic that doesn't get enough coverage, but there's enough on the internet that you can certainly get smart about the subject matter. But that's not the key thing. The key thing is for young people on campus to start leading the way. And let me tell you what you can do that's most significant. Elected officials right now barely ever talk about or think about water issues. Now, I have been very fortunate. I have been to the White House 5 different times briefing staff about water issues. I have been to Congress, I've spoken to the Senate and to the House of Representatives on a few occasions. And there is an interest, but there's not a lot of activity. And the reason there's a lot of activity is because that's the way politics in America works. If the elected official gets a question from somebody at a town hall, or a question is sent to their office, what are you doing, Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. elected official, about this or that problem? The first time they get it, they're not going to do much about it. The second time, maybe a little bit more, but not much. But if they start getting a question on a regular basis, I'm concerned about X. I'm concerned about the quality of our drinking water. I'm concerned about what we're doing about water scarcity in the Southwest and the Southeast of this country. I am concerned about the Great Lakes being a source of water for the Middle America. I am concerned about what we're going to do about all kinds of contaminants in our drinking water that are affecting my health, the health of my friends, my family. When they start getting question after question like that, day after day, week after week, you know what happens? First, they appoint a staffer to get smart on the issue. Then they appoint that staffer to get them smart on the issue. Then they start reading about it and getting really smart about it and talking about it. And then they'll pass legislation and start doing things that are valuable. So the first step is for you to get smart about the issues, for you to get smart about what can be done. And there's a lot that can be done.
Thank you. Our next question is, what do you think other countries experiencing a decrease in water supply could learn from Israel?
Well, I know that it's happening on a daily basis. Not last year, 2020, but in 2019, we often talk about, those of us who are friends of Israel, we often talk about Israel's isolation, and that's possibly true. It's not completely fabricated, but we don't talk about the other side of the equation, where Israel has a magnetic pull to countries and people all over the world. So little Israel in 2019 had over 6,000 government officials, water officials, and entrepreneurs and business executives from around the world, from many, many countries involved in water, coming to Israel to learn from Israel, to see how they do what they do. And so we don't have to wait very long to find out what countries around the world can learn. They are learning. Now, not every country can learn everything that Israel does, because it's a different situation. When I was in the Czech Republic, obviously I didn't say that they should do desalination, because it's a landlocked country. They don't have access to desalination, but they can be doing other things. And there are other countries that are very poor, that can't afford to, that may not have a seashore, that may not be able to afford desalination. But what Israel has done in terms of public education, in terms of conservation, in terms of using the use of market forces to educate, to transform behavior by their populations, what Israel has done with governance, what Israel has done with the idea of making their water authority completely apolitical, which is something that almost no one else in the world does. What Israel has done in terms of integrating technology, drip irrigation, reuse of treated water, desalinated water. All of these and many other technologies are technologies that countries, communities, and regions around the world can adopt and learn from Israel.
Thank you. Okay, our next question. How do you envision water access in Israel changing over the next generation of Israelis?
Well, I think what's going to happen most over the next generation is that Israelis are, not water-saving robots, and they are going to be like everyone else. That, with the passage of a few years, they stop thinking about the fact that they once had a water scarcity issue. And I think it's a problem that you're going to have to remind people of generation after generation, year after year, that Israel is in a very dry region of the world. It's very prone to drought. But what Israel has done that no other country in the world has done is it's made itself weather immune. There could be right now a drought of 20 years. It wouldn't really, it'd be awful, but it wouldn't really matter because Israel has now currently extracts about 2/3 of its total water that it uses from manufactured sources. So if Israel had to, it could ramp up that amount in a matter of a few years to yet higher numbers, even to 100% if need be. So that is the first thing about Israel, is that people may not be as mindful about the problems because their water is now so abundant in Israel and so easy to obtain. But the other thing that is so extraordinary about Israel is in a world where, this won't surprise you, that most governments don't really plan that far out ahead. Long-range planning might be next week. So I'm saying that as a bit of a joke, but long-range planning is generally not, years and years out. Israel's recently completed its year 2050 water plan, where they talk about how many new desalination plants they're going to need and what new technologies they're going to need to have brought online to transform their water story. So that's a pretty exciting fact that Israel is thinking so far ahead, and that's another model for the world at large.
Thank you. All right. With the constantly changing political climate in the Middle East, how do you see water shaping future peace processes and accords?
Well, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think that it's likely that you're going to see more of what you're seeing happening right now. I would have to say that if one were to look and make a list of the most water troubled countries in the world, the majority of them by far are Islamic countries. And so I'm not suggesting that tomorrow Pakistan, which is a rabidly anti-Semitic country, or Malaysia is going to be forming diplomatic relations with Israel, but I am absolutely positive, confident that, pick a time frame, 5 years, 10 years, there's no doubt in my mind that will be the case. And the reason for that will not be exclusively because of water, but it will be largely because of innovation. The key driver here in this current thrust is two men in the Arab Gulf, Mohammed bin Salman, I think it's Zalman, but it's MBS and MBZ. I might have the MBZ wrong, but I'm not sure. One from United Arab Emirates, MBZ, and one from Saudi Arabia, MBS. And they are saying, we are cooked, we are finished. The world is going off of oil to alternative energy. We have a growing population. We have no possibility of thriving if we can't make it in a more innovative world. Oil alone itself isn't covering our budgets right now, hardly in some countries. And so therefore we need to make this happen. By the way, I will share with you a true story. On Friday afternoon, I had a conversation with a senior official from the United Arab Emirates. And I said, what are your goals? And he said, we want to be just like Israel. The United Arab Emirates, they have 1 million citizens. They have 8 million guest workers. They have an inexhaustible supply of oil. They add about $1 billion to their national treasury every 10 or 12 days. And they want to be like Israel? Yeah, because they look at the innovation culture of Israel and they understand that that's where they need to be if they're going to be surviving 50 years from now. That same mentality will sooner or later percolate down to every country. And that what will happen is not every country is going to want to be in love with Israel, but every country is going to understand that it serves their selfish interests to have a relationship of some kind with Israel. And that's going to be the game changer, the innovation culture, innovation economy.
That is a great segue into our next question, which is Israel is known for innovating and always creating solutions to problems. Where do you think that comes from?
I think it comes from a combination of the two parts of Jewish culture in Israel. I read about this in Let There Be Water. You have two, in a sense, competing but ultimately complementary ideas. You have a very ancient civilization, called that the religious civilization, the civilization of 2,000, 3,000, 3,500 years ago that percolates up to the current day. And that's a culture that gives Israel its solidity. It gives it its sense of purpose and long-term sense. Even for people who are not religious, everyone understands that this comes from the Bible, it comes from a long tradition of religion. But that religious tradition also is one that is filled with questioning and challenging authority. You may have heard of the practice of chavruta, which is religious people engage in on a daily basis, where you talk about a page of Talmud or some other biblical element, and you have a discussion, an argument about it. And that type of argumentation permeates a culture and creates a mindset that says we don't have to accept the answer that's right in front of us. That's the one half of the culture. The other half of the culture is the Zionist culture. And the Zionist culture comes about, as I said earlier, call it about 100, it starts in the most early sense of it in the 1860s, but in the most dynamic sense, it starts really in the late 1890s. And it gains velocity in the years that follow. And that Zionist mentality was not just a political revolution. It was not just a revolution of getting a land for dispersed people. It was also a sociological and anthropological revolution. And so how do we know this? We know this because the early Zionists came with the idea that we will question everything. How is it that David Ben-Gurion has the name David Ben-Gurion? That was not his name. Shimon Peres, his name was not Shimon Peres. They became new people. Golda Meir was not Golda Meir. She became a new woman. The Zionist idea was the reforming, the reformation of humanity, but reformation primarily of Jewish identity. They challenged everything. When I interviewed Shimon Peres, the former president and former prime minister of Israel, for my book, Let There Be Water, he told me extraordinarily interesting stories of when he first arrived and moved to a kibbutz, a collective farm. Every single person was charged with trying something new, something odd. You remember telling me that he was responsible for irrigating, for watering the olive trees with heated water, because the thought was that maybe that would produce a bigger yield. Now, most of the ideas, as he said, and as we know, were idiotic, impossibly foolish, but a number of them weren't. You know, the thought of desalting the sea, which is what Ben-Gurion writes about the first prime minister of Israel writes about in his diaries. Desalting the sea was something that was thought of as science fiction. It was impossible. You couldn't possibly, at any affordable price, desalt the sea and create drinking water. How crazy could that be? Yet nonetheless, Ben-Gurion, coming out of the tradition of the Zionists of challenging everything, and of the Jewish tradition of being solidly based in the land, but also questioning, goes ahead, and when the country has basically no money, he creates an agency of the government to start studying how they could desalinate the Mediterranean and have water for everybody, including, by the way, all the Arab neighbors. And he was right. And that type of mentality, that type of thinking about it, really is a change agent that I think is going to permeate the whole world.
Someone from the audience is wondering about the issues that desalination might have on the environment in the long run, and if there are any negative side effects.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. The desalination has a couple of different effects. One, which is not an effect, is the salinization, that is the making ocean water saltier, because there's just such a vast amount of seawater, and there's amount of desalinated water. And what happens is you take seawater out, you separate the salty and mineral stuff. That's called the brine. You take the pure water and you keep that, and the brine you send back to the ocean or the sea. That amount of brine is just not enough to salinate the oceans, and even the area where the brine is put back into the ocean, even there, they have something called diffusers. So they diffuse it and it dilutes it out pretty quickly. So it's not a significant effect. What is a significant effect, by the way, I mentioned earlier the damming of the Tigris-Euphrates River. I mentioned the damming of the Nile. I mentioned the damming of the Indus River. Those are concerning because all that fresh water, the trillions and trillions of gallons of fresh water, which go into the sea, are having a salinating effect on ocean and sea water. The Mediterranean today is not significantly, but somewhat saltier than it was in 1950. Well, that's not because of Israel's desalination. That's because of the Nile River Dam called the Aswan High Dam, which has blocked the Nile from getting to the Mediterranean for something like 60 years now or something like that. So that's really what is calling salinization. So that's one concern that people have about desalination. Another concern people have is, what about the fish? You're sucking water out of the ocean. Is it killing the fish? And in the early days of desalination, it did have a problem with that. But they've done detailed and great studies on fish populations in the areas of the intake. And what they've learned is, quite interestingly, is that it has nearly no effect at all, because now the diffusers are so, the intake valves are so sophisticated in how they take the water in, that there's not a lot of impact on fish in the ocean. There's some small impact on fish egg population, but as you probably know, a fish creates just a massively larger amount of fish eggs than is needed to fertilize the amount of fish that it's trying to be fertilized. So that also has no significant impact or impact at all on fish population. The only place that is true is that to desalinate water, you need to have an energy source. Now, desalination is agnostic as to what that source is. It could be solar, it could be wind, it could be anything. So, but it also could be oil or coal or natural gas. To the extent that carbon fuels are used to generate the electricity that is used to power desalination plants, that is more a carbon fuel that is coming into the environment. But on the other hand, we're getting smarter and smarter about energy production, and we all can see a day, 5 years, 25 years from now, somewhere in that time frame, where carbon fuels will be very less significant and alternative energy will be much more significant. I think we can safely bet on that. And in addition, Israeli desalination has become hyper efficient in terms of how it uses its energy. And so the amount of electricity needed for desalination today is a small fraction of what it was in the earlier days of desalination. I would also finally say about the electricity and the carbon fuel piece, because I do get asked this a lot. So I looked into it a few years ago. How much electricity are we talking about? And it turns out that all the water that is used by a family of 4 or 5, all the water, the drinking water, preparing food, making soup, making ice cubes, watering their lawn, taking showers, taking even long showers, slip and slide in the backyard, everything, all that together is akin to the same amount of energy that is used to power the refrigerator in an average American home. And so we don't say, let's get rid of that refrigerator because it uses carbon energy. And so there are many, 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 many uses of electricity and carbon fuels that are far greater in America than desalination. And I think that to give people the chance to live high quality lives and give them high quality water is probably worth whatever the extra energy use it is. And I, like everybody, would like to see more alternative energy use for this. I would add also, by the way, that in many of the places where desalination is being used are very sunny, hot places, and that gives very, very good opportunity for solar power to be utilized.
Okay. The next question is, where can Israel and the USA go from here with water in 2021?
Well, America is just beginning to have its great water problems come to the surface, and people becoming ever more aware of it. Water scarcity is one problem, water quality is another problem, and grave problems in farming. America not only grows its own food for our own people, but we grow food for the people around the world to a very large degree. And we have overtaxed our water supplies. The water comes in two main varieties: either groundwater, that's water that's down underneath the soil that we have to pump out, or surface water, that's lakes and rivers. And we have grossly overtaxed our groundwater, such that some vast and significant aquifers have been overtaxed and are now dry. Aquifers that took thousands and thousands of years to fill and that could never now be refilled are now dry. They've been pumped out. And that's a problem. In other parts of America, Southern California, the farming areas of Central California, the Midwest of the United States, they've pumped so much groundwater out that we find ourselves now in a very problematical situation that we're as much as 400 feet below surface. And at that level, you get very bad water. You get water that's filled with arsenic, heavy metals, and other contaminants. So we have a very big problem here in the United States. I'm an American. I care about this a lot. I obviously care about it. I've written 2 books about it, done a lot of research about it, interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people. So America still has a lot to learn about this, about what to do about this, how to do the technology of it all, how to handle governance, how to do pricing. And Israel's going to be a model, and is a model for America in community after community. I mean, I'm speaking with you all tonight, but there isn't a lot of time when I'm not being asked and actually speaking to communities all around America, talking about what they can be doing. And invariably, the solution is, how do I become more like Israel and doing what I want to do?
Thank you. All right, our last question is, how did you first get involved with JNF?
Oh, it was well, I mean, I had heard of JNF from the time I was a college student, but I didn't pay much attention to it. Thank you for that question. I mean, I knew about the little coin box, charity box, but I did not know about the incredible work of JNF. Somehow or other, it just escaped my notice. And that's a shame. I regard myself as deeply involved in both my American community, but also my American Jewish community and my world Jewish community. And I was involved, I'll go to the list of organizations here, but I was very involved at a very high level with quite a number of organizations. And to my great disappointment now looking back, I just somehow or other never knew about the work of JNF. I thought they planted trees. And, and sometimes when I do a favor for somebody, or it was my birthday, somebody would send a tree or 5 trees or 10 trees or 25 trees in Israel. And I always appreciated it. It's like, great, Israel's a dry place, probably good that they have trees. That was sort of my mindset. So I started doing research for Let There Be Water. And I wouldn't say everywhere I turned, JNF popped up, but JNF certainly became a very significant part of that story. And so I called cold. I called the executive director or the CEO, I don't remember his title, truly a genius, visionary, once in a generation kind of talent named Russell Robinson, who's the current head of JNF. I called him. He didn't act like a big shot. He said, sure. Who was I? I was nobody. I wasn't a donor. I'd never written a book about anything, certainly not a book about water. He said, sure, come on over. Let's have a conversation. Came over, we talked. What was supposed to be 15 minutes ended up being about 2 hours. And he said to me at the end of the conversation, you tell me what I can do to be helpful. I will turn all of my resources over to help you. And he really did. He made so many introductions for me. He made my book so much better, so much richer, so much more nuanced by virtue of all the different people I got to meet through his introductions. I went back and forth to Israel many times. I spent 9 weeks in Israel. In addition, doing detailed interviews. I did 585 interviews. Not all of them came from JNF and Russell Robinson, but a fair number did. And so as I learned more and more about JNF and JNF's work, I said, hey, I can't let other people carry this ball themselves. I said, I want to become a donor. I want to be helpful to JNF. And I said to Russell, tell me how I can be helpful, which is a dangerous thing to say to Russell. So don't say it unless you mean it or unless you're ready to have him answer. But and so ever since then, I've been something of a JNF activist, a donor, and very delighted to speak to JNF audiences here, there, and everywhere. So thank you, and thank you, Julia, at your wonderful, young, dynamic age, that you are taking your incredible talents, and they are manifest and obvious from this hour together, and that you're doing it to serve the community and to serve, I would say, humanity. There's something about Israel that serves humanity, but something about JNF because it's basically inherently an environmental organization that is serving humanity as well. So thank you for all you do.
Thank you so much, Seth. My name is Yochanan Ghibli, and I am the JNF Campus Fellow at Arizona State University. I'm currently a senior studying computer information systems outside of JNF. I'm on the board of the Jewish Arizonians on campus and am an active member of the Chabad on campus. I'm a proud alumni of JNF's College Summit, as well as Alternative Winter Break and Alexander Muss High School in Israel. During my numerous trips to Israel, I've been able to see firsthand the impact JNF has in improving the lives of Israelis. And once again, thank you so much, Seth, for spending the night with us. I wanted to thank everyone for coming tonight and for joining us for our first program of the week. Again, I would like to remind you to visit myjnf.org/TBS on campus to purchase a treat certificate in honor of someone you care about. Additionally, I want to let you know about Alternative Winter Break, an opportunity to travel and volunteer in Israel this summer for free with Jewish National Fund. I will be going, and I hope you will join me. Learn the details and register at jnf.org/break. Please join us for our next program tomorrow evening at 7:30 Eastern Standard Time for Branching Out, a BiShvat yoga practice. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you and good night.